Hello, this is Matthew with Simplilearn, and today we're going to go through our second round of interview questions following on from the previous video that we did last week. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and cover the following areas. So we've already covered some areas, but as a reminder, what DevOps really allows us to cover are a number of areas for interview questions. So there's going to be general interview questions, source code management questions, continuous integration and testing questions, and then configuration management, containerization, and continuous monitoring. We've already covered part 1 in the video, and there should be a link at the top of the screen that'll take you to part 1. What we're going to do in this video is go through part 2, where we're going to deep dive on configuration management, containerization, and continuous monitoring, specifically focusing on tools such as Chef, Puppet, Ansible, Docker, and Nagios. So let's just get into the first section, which is configuration management. So one of the questions that you'll get asked right away is, why do you have SSL certificates used for Chef? Really fundamentally, your immediate answer should be security. SSL provides for a very high level of private security and private and public key pairing. This really is essential to ensure that you have a secure environment throughout your entire network. The second part should be that if you're using SSL and you're using the private public key model within SSL, you're able to guarantee the systems on your network that the Chef, that you'll be able to validate that the nodes within your network that Chef is validating against actually are the real nodes themselves, not imposters. So you will also be asked some questions such as the following: which of the following commands would you use to stop or disable the HTTP service when the system boots? And you'll typically get 4 responses, and there'll be hashtag systemctl disable httpd.service, or is it system disable http.service, system disable httpd, or the final option, which is systemctl disable httpd.service. Your answer should be the first one, which is hashtag systemctl disable http.service. So Chef comes with a series of tools that allow it to function effectively, and one of the tools that you're going to be asked about is, what is Test Kitchen? And Test Kitchen is essentially a command line tool that allows you to be able to test out your cookbook before you actually deploy it to a real node. So some of the commands that you would use are, for instance, if you want to create an instance of Test Kitchen, you would do kitchen create. If you want to destroy an instance after you created it, you do kitchen destroy. And if you want to be able to combine multiple instances, you would do kitchen converge. So a question you'll get is around Chef is, how does Chef Apply differ from Chef Client? So fundamentally, the difference between them is that Chef Apply will validate the recipe that you're working on, whereas Chef Client looks to apply and validate the entire cookbook that's run in your server environment. So one is focused on the recipe and the other is focused on the entire cookbook. So there are some differences when you're working with different command lines. So for instance, when you're working with Puppet and you're working with one version of Puppet and you want to do what is the command to sign a requested certificate, the top example here is for Puppet version 2.7, whereas the lower option here is for Puppet version 3. And that's something to bear in mind when you're going through your interview process, is that the tools that are used within a continuous integration, continuous delivery DevOps model do vary. And so you want to be able to talk knowledgeably about the different versions of the tools so that when you're talking to your interviewer, you're able to show the deep knowledge that you have. Which open source or community tools do you use to make Puppet more powerful? And essentially this question is going to be asking you to look beyond the core foundation of Puppet itself. And so the 3 options you have is being able to track configurations with Jira, which you should be doing anyway, but it's a great way to be able to clearly communicate the work that's being done with Puppet. Version control can be extended with Git. And then the changes should be passed through Jenkins. So the 3 tools you want to be looking at: integration with Jira, Git, and Jenkins. So what are the resources in Puppet? Well, fundamentally, there are 4. The resources are a basic unit of any configuration management tool. They are the features of the nodes. They are the written catalog and the execution of the catalog on a node. So as we dig deeper into Puppet, One of the things that you are likely to be asked regarding Puppet is, what is a class in Puppet? And so a class in Puppet is really the name blocks in your manifest that contain the various configurations. And this can include services, files, and packages. And we have on the screen here an example of what a class would look like when you write it out. And you may want to memorize just one class. Don't memorize just a whole set of classes. Just memorize one. The person that's interviewing you is just really looking for someone who has a working knowledge. They're not looking for you to have memorized complete massive classes, but having one small class to be able to illustrate the experience you have is extremely valuable to the interviewer, particularly if it's a technical interview. So as we move into Ansible, one of the things that you're going to be asked around Ansible is, what is Ansible role? So a role is an independent block of tasks and variable files and templates embedded inside of the playbook. So the example we have here on the screen actually shows you one role within a playbook. And in this role, it is to install Tomcat on a node. Again, as with previous question within Puppet of a class, it's probably good to have memorized just one or two roles so you can talk knowledgeably about Ansible when you're having your interview. So when you're working with Ansible, when should you be using the curly brackets? And so just as a frame of reference, there's often two different ways that these kind of brackets are referred to. They're either referred to as French brackets or curly brackets. Either way, what you'll be wanting to ask is, when would you use these specific types of brackets within Ansible? And really, the answer comes down to two things. One is that it makes it easier to distinguish strings and undefined variables. And the second is for putting together conditional statements when you are actually using variables. And the example we have here is this prints the value of, and we have foo, and we have to then put in the variable conditional statement of foo is defined as something. So what is the best way to make content reusable and redistributable with Ansible? And there's really essentially three. The first is to include a submodule or another file in your playbook. The second is to import an improvement of an include, which ensures that a file is added only once. And then the third is roles to manage the tasks within the playbook. So a question you will be asked is, provide differences between Ansible and Puppets. So if we look at Ansible, it's a very easy agentless installation. It's based on Python. You can configure it with YAML, and there are no support for Windows. In contrast, Puppet is an agent-based installation. It's written in Ruby. The configuration files are written in DSL, and it has support on all popular operating systems. So we dig deeper into the actual architecture. Ansible, it has a much more simple architecture, and it's definitely a push-only architecture. In contrast to Puppet, it's a more complicated but more sophisticated architecture where you're able to have a complete environment managed by the Puppet architecture. So let's get on to our next section, which is containerization. So let's go through, and you're going to be asked to explain what the architecture of Docker is. And Docker really is the most popular containerization environment. So Docker uses a client-server architecture. The Docker client is a service which runs in a command line. And then the Docker daemon, which is run as a REST API within the command line, will accept the requests and interacts with the operating system in order to build the Docker images and run the Docker containers. And then the Docker image is a template of instructions which is used to create containers. The Docker container is an executable package of applications and its dependencies together. And then finally, the Docker registry is a service to host and distribute Docker images among other users. So you'll also be asked to provide what are the advantages of Docker over virtual machine. And this is something that comes up very consistently. In fact, you may want to even extend it as having what are the differences between having a dedicated machine, a virtual machine, and a Docker or Docker-like environment. And really, the arguments for Docker are just absolutely fantastic. First of all, Docker containers occupy significantly less space than a virtual machine or a dedicated machine. The boot up time on Docker is significantly faster than a VM. Containers have a much better performance as they are hosted in a single Docker image. Docker is highly efficient and very easy to scale, particularly when you start working with Kubernetes. Easily portable across multiple platforms. And then finally, For space allocation, Docker data volumes can be shared and reused among multiple containers. The argument against virtual machines is significant, and particularly if you're going into an older environment where a company is still using actual dedicated hardware and haven't moved to a cloud or cloud-like environment, your arguments for Docker are going to be very, very persuasive. Be very clear on what the advantages are for Docker over a virtual machine, because you want to be able to succinctly share them with your team. And this is something that's important when you're going through the interview process, but also equally important, particularly if you're working with a company that's transitioning or going through a digital transformation where they aren't used to working with tools like Docker. You need to be able to effectively share with that team what the benefits are. So how do we share Docker containers with different nodes? And in this instance, what you want to be able to do is leverage the power of Docker Swarm. So Docker Swarm is a tool which allows the IT administrators and developers to create and manage clusters of Swarm nodes within the Docker platform. And there are two elements to the node. There's the manager node, and then there's the worker node. The manager node, as you'd assume, manages the entire infrastructure, and the worker node is actually the work of the agent as it gets executed. So what are the commands to create a Docker Swarm? And so here we have an example of what a manager node would look like. And once you've created a swarm on your manager node, you can now add worker nodes to that swarm. And again, when you're stepping through this process, be very precise in the execution part that needs to be taken to be able to effectively create a swarm. So start with the manager node, and then you create a worker node. And then finally, when a node is initialized as a manager node, it can immediately create a token, and that token is used for the worker nodes and associating the IP address with the worker nodes. Question 17, how to run multiple containers using a single service. It is possible to run multiple containers as a single service by using Docker Compose. And Docker Compose will actually run each of the services in isolation so that they can interact with each other. The language used to write out the compose files that allow you to run the service is called YAML, and YAML stands for yet another markup language. So what is the use of a Docker file? So a Docker file actually is used for creating Docker images using the build command. So let's go through and show on the screen what that would look like. And this would be an opportunity where if you're actually in a technical interview, you could potentially even ask, hey, can I draw on a whiteboard and show you what the architecture for using the build command would look like and what the process would look like? Again, when you're going through an interview process, as someone who interviews a lot of people, one of the things that I really like is when an interview candidate does something that's slightly different. And in this instance, this is a great example of where you can stand up to the whiteboard and actually show what can actually be done through actually creating images on the whiteboard very quickly, little square boxes where you can actually show the flow for creating a build environment. As an architect, this should be something that you are comfortable doing, and by doing it in the interview, and certainly you want to ask permission before you actually do it, but doing this in the interview really helps demonstrate your comfortable feelings of working with these kind of architecture drawings. So back to the question of creating a Docker file. So we go through and we have a Docker file that actually then goes ahead and creates the Docker image, which then in turn creates the Docker container. And then we are able to push that out up to a Docker Hub and then share that Docker Hub with everybody else as part of the Docker registry with the whole network. So what are the differences between Docker image and Docker containers? So let's go through the Docker image. So the Docker images are templates of a Docker container. An image is built using a Docker file, and it stores that Docker file in a Docker repository or a Docker Hub. And you can use Docker Hub as an example. And the image layer is a read-only file system. The Docker container is a collection of the runtime instances of a Docker image, and the containers are created using Docker images, and they are stored in the Docker daemon, and every container is a read-write file system. So you can't replace the information, you can only append to it. So while you can actually use YAML for writing so a question you're going to be asked is, instead of YAML, what can be an alternate file to build Docker Compose? So YAML is the one that is the default, but you can also use JSON. So if you are comfortable working with JSON, and that is something that you should be get comfortable with, is you want to be able to use that to name your files. And as a frame of reference, JSON is a logical way of being able to do value paired matching using a JavaScript-like syntax. So you're going to be asked to how to create a Docker container. So let's go through what that would look, and we'll break it down task by task. So the task is going to be create a MySQL Docker container. So to do that, you want to be able to build a Docker image or pull from an existing Docker image from a Docker repository or hub. And then you want to be able to then use Docker to create a new container, which has MySQL from the existing Docker image. Simultaneously, the layer of read-write file system is also created on top of that image. And below at the bottom of the screen, we have what the command lines look for that. So what is the difference between a registry and a repository? So let's go through that. So for the Docker registry and repository, for the registry, we have a Docker registry is an open source server-side service used for hosting and distributing Docker images, whereas in contrast, for repository, it's a collection of multiple versions of a Docker image. In a registry, a user can distinguish between Docker images with their tag names. And then finally, on the registry, Docker also has its own default registry called Docker Hub. For the repository, it is a collection of multiple versions of Docker images. It is stored in a Docker registry, and it has two types, a public and private registry, so you can actually create your own enterprise registry. So you're going to be asked, what are the cloud platforms that support Docker? Really, list them all. We have listed here Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Rackspace, but you could add in there IBM, Bluemix. You could put in Red Hat. Really, any of the cloud service providers out there today do support Docker. It's just become an industry standard. So what is the purpose of expose and publish commands in Docker? So if we go through, expose is an instruction used in Dockerfile, whereas publish is used in Docker run command. For expose, it is used to expose ports within a Docker network, whereas with publish, it can be used outside of a Docker environment. For expose, it is a documenting instruction used at the time of building an image and running a container, whereas with publish, it is used to map a host port to a running container port. For expose is the command used in Docker, whereas for publish, we use the command -p for when we're doing our command line used in Docker. And examples of these are expose 8080, or with Docker, we would put in, or for publish, we would do the example Docker run -d-p and then 0.0.0.80, 80:80 as our command line. So let's look at continuous monitoring. So with continuous monitoring, how does Nagios help in continuous monitoring of systems, applications, and servers? And so this is really just a high-level question of using Nagios within your environment. And you should be able to just come back very quickly and say, Nagios allows you to help manage the servers and check if they're being sufficiently utilized and if there are any task failures that need to be addressed. And so there are three areas of utilization and risk that you want to be able to manage. This is being able to verify the status and services of the entire network, the health of your infrastructure as a whole, and if applications are working properly together with web services and APIs that are reachable. So the second question you'll be asked is, how does Nagios help in continuous monitoring of systems, applications, and services? So it's able to do this by having the initial Nagios process and scheduler and the additional plugins that you would use for your network connect with the remote resources and the Nagios web interface to be able to run status checks on a predefined schedule. So what do you mean by Nagios Remote Plugin Executor, or the NPRE of Nagios? So NPRE allows you to execute plugins on Linux Unix machines that allow you to do additional monitoring and machine metrics such as disk usage, CPU load, etc. What are the ports used by Nagios for monitoring purposes? In this example, there are three, and they're easy to remember, so I would memorize these three, but they're essentially ports 5666, 5667, and 5668. So there are two types of checks within Nagios. So you will be asked for what is an active and passive check in Nagios. So an active check is initiated by the Nagios process and is run on a regular schedule. A passive check is initiated and formed by an external application or process. So this may be where a system is failing. And results are submitted to Nagios for processing. And to continue with this, for what is an active and passive check, active checks are initiated by the check logic within the Nagios daemon. Nagios will execute a plugin and pass information about what needs to be checked. Plugin will then check the operational state of the host or service and then process the results of the host or service check and send out notifications. In contrast with the passive check, it is an external application that initiates the check. It writes the results of the check to an external command line file. Nagios reads the external command file and places the results of all passive checks in a queue for later processing, so you can go back and revalidate. And then Nagios may send out notifications, log alerts, etc., depending on the results that they get from checking the information. So you're going to be asked to explain the main configuration file and its location in Nagios. So the main configuration file consists of a number of directives that affect how Nagios operates. So consider this as the configuration file that is read by both Nagios processor and the CGIs. So this will allow you to be able to manage the main configuration file that's placed into your settings directory. So what is the Nagios Network Analyzer? And again, hold out your 4 fingers because there are 4 options here. So the Nagios Network Analyzer 1, provides an in-depth look at all your network traffic source and security threats. 2, allows system admins to gather high-level information on the health of your network. 3, provides a central view of your network traffic and bandwidth data. And then 4, allows you to be proactive in resolving outages, abnormal behavior, and threats before they affect critical business processes. So what are the benefits of HTTP and SSL certificate monitoring with Nagios? So with HTTP certificate monitoring, it allows you to have increased server and services and application availability, obviously very important. Fast detection of network outages and protocol failures, and allows web transaction and web service performance monitoring. The SSL certificate monitoring allows you for increased website availability, frequent application availability, and provides increased security. So explain virtualization with Nagios. So in response to this, the first thing you should be able to talk about is how Nagios itself can run on many different virtualization platforms, including Microsoft Visual PC, VMware, Xen, Amazon EC2, etc., etc. So just make sure you get that right off the bat. Nagios is able to provide capabilities to monitor an assortment of metrics on different platforms. It allows for quick detection of service and application failures, and has the ability to be able to monitor against many metrics, including CPU usage, memory, networking, and VM status. So name the 3 variables that affect recursion inheritance in Nagios, and it is name, use, and register. So name is a template name that can be referenced in other object definitions. Use specifies the name of the template object that you want to inherit its properties and variables from. And register indicates whether or not the object definition should be registered to Nagios. And on the right-hand side of the screen, we have an example of what that script would look like. Again, you may want to be able to memorize this, as it's something that you can actually write down and show someone if you're going through a technical interview. So why is Nagios said to be object-oriented? And fundamentally, it comes down to the object configuration format that you can use in your object definitions. It allows you to inherit properties from other object definitions, and this is typical of object-oriented development and is now applied for the Nagios environment. So some of the objects that you can inherit are services, hosts, commands, and time periods. So finally, explain what is state talking in Nagios. And so there are really 4 options here when you're talking about state stalking. So state stalking is used for logging purposes in Nagios. It allows you to enable for a particular host or service that Nagios will watch over very carefully. It will log any changes it sees in the output of the check results. And then finally, helps the analysis of log files. So hopefully you learned something from our second interview DevOps question video. If there were questions that you've been asked in DevOps interviews that we didn't cover here, please put them in the comments below. We're always looking for great feedback that we can use to be able to improve the services that we have here today.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.